Hey, everybody. In this episode of the Backpacking Light podcast, we interview physical therapist and athletic performance coach and trainer John Zombro about foot health, footwear, training, and more.
Look for me in the mountains where walking has a way of pulling you to your peace of mind every day.
Welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan.
And in this episode, we're chatting with John Zombro. John is a physical therapist and coach, and he has a lot of interesting things to say about longevity, injury prevention, and injury recovery, especially with regards to the feet. But before we get to that, Ryan, it's been a few months since we've actually had one of these long episodes together. So what is new with you?
I am rehabbing an ankle injury. I can't remember if I talked about this on the podcast or not yet. I fell into a ditch in the middle of the night. Well, it wasn't the middle of the night, but it was dark, and I didn't have a headlamp with me. I was in the forest. And the ditch was about 3 feet deep, and I landed right on my ankle, incurred a grade 2 ankle sprain in 3 separate ligaments. And so it was a pretty major injury. And I have been working on rehab since then, and it's been going well. I'm about 10 or 11 weeks in right now, and was able to hike 7 miles through snow with some post-holing yesterday. Still have some pain, definitely some fatigue today, but well on track to get back to backpacking pretty soon.
And our guest today actually helped you, at least with the initial phases of your rehab, right?
He did. And I've gone through several rehabs with our guest, and we'll talk a little bit about that on the podcast today.
Awesome. Well, my new favorite thing is a book that you actually recommended to me, and it's called Training for the Uphill Athlete. It is put out through Patagonia's imprint, and it's a very weighty book. I got it for Christmas. I've just read the introduction. So what is it about this book that you find so compelling?
It is comprehensive. It's a reference manual. I've read it several times, cover to cover. It's on my shelf all the time, and I look at it constantly. The book before this was Training for the New Alpinism. It was written by Steve House, an alpinist, and Scott Johnston, a trainer. And they have a very foundational approach to training, and it's based on years of unrefuted scientific evidence. We're faced with such trends and hacks in the fitness world today, and most of them just don't hold any salt. And so it's so nice to have a methodical training manual that can be used for endurance athletes, and backpacking is most certainly an endurance sport. So Training for the New Alpinism was targeted towards alpine climbers. Training for the Uphill Athlete is targeted for anybody who likes to haul their body and their gear up hills. That would include alpinists, but also ski mountaineers, mountain runners and ultra runners, and of course backpackers. And so it's really a manual that's targeted towards increasing your base level of endurance and maximizing the muscular endurance that's required to go long distances with a lot of muscular effort, as is the case when we're backpacking up hills. So these two books are actually foundational for our program that we teach in backpacking fitness and training, and they'll be our textbooks for our upcoming online course on training for backpacking.
Very cool. Yeah, just one more side note. You talked about hacks. I just got all of my year in review data from Whoop. We've talked about the Whoop platform and straps before here on the podcast. And it was interesting to see that the two behaviors that impacted my recovery the most were hydration and eating fruits and vegetables. So it's kind of struck me as humorous because I didn't have to wear the Whoop to know that those were good things.
So you tracked your diet with Whoop then?
Yeah, the journal has it's pretty comprehensive, the daily
Yeah.
journal you can enter in every day. And I think the food related things are like, are you eating meat or not? Are you eating dairy or not? How much of those things are you eating? And it also has a thing that you can enter in how many servings of fruits and vegetables you eat
Yep.
per day.
I'm a vegetable eater. I love vegetables. I have no issue downing as many vegetables as possible. I struggle with fruits. I really like berries, but it's hard for me to down sugars and fruits in general. But I did notice in my year in review with Whoop that when I ate substantial amounts of fruit in my diet, my recovery improved.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, I don't eat a lot of dairy, but I love ice cream and sour cream and cheese. Cheese is terrible for me. And so when I was eating cheese in substantial quantities, that inhibited my recovery. So that's not going to keep me from eating queso and chips. In fact, I had a serving tonight, but it definitely keeps me focused on just balancing my diet with the things that are the healthiest.
The other metric that positively impacted my recovery was irritability. On days when I noted high levels of irritability, I also recovered very well the next day. I have no idea what that's correlating with. There's obviously some other factor there that's messing with that, but I also found that interesting.
That is interesting. Now you got to find out what makes you irritable and replicate
Yeah,
it.
I have it's a long list. All right, well, let's jump into our interview. Ryan, why don't you introduce our guest?
Our guest today is John Zombro. John and I have known each other for decades, going on 25 years now. And John is the proprietor, director, and athletic coach and trainer at a company called the Lifetime Athlete in Bozeman, Montana. This is his post-retirement activity. John has spent years as a physical therapist, and now he has transitioned into becoming a coach, author, and speaker. He is currently focused in peak human performance with an emphasis on advanced training methods and comprehensive wellness education. And this is one thing I've always appreciated about John when I've worked with him in a PT scenario is he always brought in kind of a whole life experience to rehab and training. He's a board certified specialist in orthopedic physical therapy, and he's a certified strength and conditioning specialist. So without further ado, here's our interview with John Zombro. All right, John from Bozeman, Montana, welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast. Great to see you again.
Hi, Ryan. Hi, Andrew. And thank you guys for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation. It's an honor.
John, can you just tell us a little bit about what your background is and kind of what your interest and area of expertise is now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I would say I am a movement geek, and I've always been fascinated with human performance. I started out playing a number of sports. I was competitive in basketball, tennis, swimming, baseball. Went on to become a slightly above mediocre middle distance runner. Did that through college, and then I found myself, trying some of the endurance sports, which were marathon and ultra distance running, road cycling, mountain biking, Nordic ski racing, all those things. And I've always liked to train in the gym, but the thing that's really anchored me through my whole life is, I grew up hiking and camping and hunting and fishing, and those are my true passions, which I still do today. As far as my education goes, I started out thinking that pre-med was the way for me, but after a year or two and a few of those observation experiences, I realized that might not be the best fit for me. So I graduated with a bachelor's degree in health and fitness promotion and a minor in business administration. So that sent me down a path of working in corporate wellness and fitness management for a couple of years. And when I finally felt like I'd saturated myself with that, I went back to school and became a physical therapist. And that's really been the primary thing that I've been doing. But I really had the bug for learning more. And so I got another degree in biomechanics and exercise physiology. And that was kind of my educational journey. And of course, along the way, you realize how much you don't know. And, you try to be a humble learner and realize you're wrong a lot, and, admit that first of all. But I picked up some of the usual certifications that go along with people in these fields. So I'm certified as a strength and conditioning specialist, and I've got a couple of therapeutic and coaching certs in there as well. And pursuant to, I think, the topics that you guys sent me to discuss, I'm board certified in orthopedic physical therapy. So I'm a member of the American Academy of Orthopedic Physical Therapy, as well as the Foot and Ankle Special Interest Group. I've worked in a variety of settings, primarily around the outpatient sports training and rehab arena. And then more recently, I'm doing a little more writing and speaking and coaching, consulting, with most of my work being based from my online platform. And so maybe that was a little longer of a story than you guys were hoping for, but now you know who you're dealing with.
John, you and I connected because I was motivated to prevent injury on a long trip I was doing across the Arctic in 2006. And so I worked with you to train for that, and have since worked with you to do injury rehabilitation a couple of different times. And I wanted to focus today's conversation on talking about both the prevention and rehab of injuries that are common to hikers. So the four we see the most are plantar fasciitis, metatarsal strains, sprained ankles, and stress fractures. So we want to walk through each of those injuries accordingly. And let's start with plantar fasciitis, because it seems to be the one that is, boy, it really niggles at people, and people have a really difficult time dealing with it. And there are, 5,000 solutions if you are an internet researcher and are trying to figure out what to do here. So talk to us about, let's start with, what is plantar fasciitis?
Okay. So the first thing that I will do in broaching the topic of plantar fasciitis is, well, let's talk about what is the plantar fascia, first of all. And it's a really strong piece of connective tissue on the bottom of the foot. It's also known as the plantar aponeurosis or aponeurosis, depending upon how you like to pronounce that. So it's a collagenous sheet of material. And it starts on your heel, actually specifically at a place called the medial calcaneal tubercle. I know there's no quiz for your listeners, but nice to explain that. And then it kind of moves forward and flares out and attaches to kind of the base of all 5 toes. And so that's what the fascia is. And then what it really does is fascinating. And I think, Ryan, with your engineering background, you'll appreciate this. It operates as a windlass mechanism. And so basically, when we are ambulating or locomoting, we're walking, running, we go through these phases of gait, where when the foot is in the air, we call that the swing phase. And when it's on the ground, it's the stance phase. But we also have these other components, which are worth mentioning as we talk about this, the etiology of this condition. So when you have initial contact or foot strike of the ground, with walking, that's probably a heel strike. And with running, it may be further up on the foot. And then we go to kind of a position known as foot flat or mid stance. And then as we start to leave the ground, first we have heel off, and then we have toe off, and we push off. So that's kind of what the cycle looks like. And everyone knows it because you've been doing it your entire life. Well, once we go into heel off, the tension that is placed upon the plantar fascia, because the toes are now, essentially bending as the forefoot's still on the ground, but the heel's lifting up, that creates that tension on the fascia, which helps to lock up the foot and convert it into a more stable or rigid lever for push off. And so that's really what the fascia is doing. It's an assistive mechanism within the foot that helps to line up our joints and bones so that, they're able to give us this rigid lever for push off, and we don't have to use all of our muscular strength or effort to accomplish that. So that's what the fascia is designed to do. And then it tends to get angry, in other words, inflamed or irritated, probably in 2 conditions. And one would be probably something that we're going to talk about several times today, which is load management. So if we just even if a person has a very normal functioning foot and they go from not hiking much to a long trip, for example, that can be enough stress just to irritate the fascia. So that can happen. But interestingly enough, when we talk about the mechanics of the foot, I think sometimes, maybe me as well, folks want to make this more complicated than it needs to be. But we have these actions in the foot known as supination and pronation. Both are natural, both are necessary. Nothing is evil here. And supination is really what happens when the foot will turn inwards, exposing the arch towards midline, and that stiffens up the foot, and it's how we initially strike the ground. But then as we go into that foot flat and we want to accommodate and adapt to our support surface, we pronate. And so pronation is happening in 3 planes, but the foot is rotating down and in as we come over it. And that allows us to, again, adapt to these surfaces. And it almost works, here's another term, as a torque converter, because it allows us to send force up the chain, the kinetic chain being our leg and the rest of the body. Well, this pronation, again, it's normal and it's not evil, but with many people, we see a problem with one of 3 things, which is rate, magnitude, or duration. And so this probably makes perfect sense, but if a person's foot is pronating a bit too rapidly, that may place an early stretch force on the plantar fascia and irritate, or have the potential to do that over many loading cycles. If we look at magnitude, that's the degree or depth of this foot flattening. And I don't like to use the term arch collapse because I don't think that's entirely correct. But, you get that picture where, gosh, we can really bottom out on our foot. And that's creating, again, more pulling on the fascial connections. And then lastly, we have the duration. So if the foot is staying pronated, which is a flexible or loose or almost floppy foot by design in the pronated state, but now we need it to be a rigid lever and it hasn't quite resupinated enough to push off strongly off that big toe, and we get a lot of play or slop in the system, that can irritate it as well. And I'll stop talking in just a moment, but all of those things result in enough microcycles where we get some micro tearing, and it usually occurs at that connection near the heel, and thus the inflammation or inflammatory process begins.
We see this more in our community perhaps than other traditional hiking communities where people are in boots, because trail running shoes, minimalist footwear in general, allows for the flexibility of the foot, and so you're more prone to overuse injuries. So what can we do? I have 2 questions actually. One is, there's a trend towards flat-footed footwear that does not have any pronation or supination control. And then there's all these, you walk into an REI and there is a whole rack of arch support insoles. So talk to us about what either of those 2 things can contribute to. Do they contribute to or mitigate plantar fasciitis? And if not, what can we do to kind of prevent it?
Yeah, this has been a really interesting thing for me over the course of my journey, and some of the training that I've had in working in footwear sales a little bit, and also in gait research and shoe wear design. And I think I have to be careful of using terms like always and never, because there are always contexts where we can apply to each individual. But I think that we had a strong mindset for a number of decades where we really want to massively support the foot, possibly lock it into one position, which doesn't really make sense mechanically, control things. Mm-hmm. And I think more currently, over the past 2 decades or so, we've certainly gotten greater awareness that, gosh, the foot is dynamic. It's made to move. We want to encourage that for the most part. And so more minimalist footwear is really entirely appropriate, because many of us have these weak, atrophied feet from, living in modern footwear as we do in our culture. So I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, Ryan, you're kind of saying, well, okay, what are some potential causal factors with either types of those footwear? And I would say that if a person only ever wears the most supportive shoes and boots and orthotics, no matter how much they hike, they're going to have weak feet, because the feet are locked into these things that, the founder of Zero Footwear, I forgot the guy's name. He's a really entertaining speaker, but he calls them foot coffins.
Stephen Sashin.
Yeah, so he calls them foot coffins, these like heavy built shoes and boots. And I think there's something to be said for that, because it is true. But at the very same time, when I look at a model of sports training, one of the things that we typically want to do is we want to, in training, we want to callus the body and build it up and give it this durability and adaptation opportunity. And so that's a great place to wear minimal footwear, or even be barefoot where it's appropriate to do so. But if a person doesn't have the maximum amount of conditioning into their connective tissues and foot structures and even rest of their body, and then they go out on, let's say, rough terrain, steep terrain, possibly off trail for long distance, they might actually be better served to wear something that's moderately supportive, because that's going to buy them a little more miles and a little decreased, challenge with loading. So it's I think very individual how we should look at this. And if you had enough time where you just did nothing but live barefoot and with minimal shoes, and your training volume, your distance hiking was very high, I'd probably say you should never wear anything that's overly substantial. But again, maybe we don't all have that opportunity. So sometimes going into a heavier shoe can work. The only thing is, like, if you got crampons on, you're kicking in steps, there's a place for a mountaineering boot, but otherwise it's not really ideal, in my opinion, for hiking and backpacking.
For sure. And I also want to follow up and say, you hit a good point here. If we have the opportunity and training volume available to us, is there a low number of training volume, like miles of barefoot hiking you can do to allow you to wear a barefoot style shoe on the trail? Or are we just kind of stuck with something that has moderate support, given our busy lives and our ability to train maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours a day?
Yeah, I think that the cop-out answer would be it depends, or it's context dependent. But instead of copping out, I would say, there's no real definitive research on this, but there probably is like a threshold or baseline amount of exposure that gives you a big return on investment. And so I don't know this, but I would say 30 to 60 minutes, 3 or 4 times per week of barefoot training will yield a huge benefit for most individuals. And so that could be, where it's appropriate to do so, actually going out and hiking barefoot or with the very minimalist shoe. But I'm also a fan of just getting people on beaches or soccer fields, and even in the gym, where either it's allowed in the gym or if you have a home gym where you just exercise barefoot. And you really get a lot out of that. So that would be my recommendation. Again, just to review, I'd say 30 to 60 minutes, 3 to 4 times per week. It's a ballpark figure.
And John, that leads me to a question, and we may be spiraling down a rabbit hole here. We'll get back to injuries in a second, but you mentioned working out barefoot, and just to clarify, is there a benefit to maybe doing strength training or high intensity interval training or circuit training, stuff like that, barefoot? Does that also improve foot conditioning?
Absolutely. And it does it from several perspectives. One, you're just thinking about mechanical loading. And so you're getting direct strengthening of the foot without a filter or a layer between, your foot ground interface. So if you don't have a shoe, that's good. But there is research on how the neurologic system, the nerve endings in the feet are so intricately tied to balance and righting reactions, and also muscle recruitment. And so I think we can make people better movers overall if we get the shoes off. You don't even have to be doing specific foot exercise. You could be doing, say, like various presses or squats or lunges or what have you, and you're going to get a great benefit from it. So I'm wherever it's safe to do so, I'm an advocate for that. You just have to be careful in some weight room environments, obviously, with whether they have policies there or also, dropping a plate on your foot. Not that any training shoe is going to protect you too much, but there are those concerns.
All right, John. So that brings us to the $1 million question: is once we get a case of plantar fasciitis, how do we manage it, heal it, rehab it?
Okay. So I would offer up that the way I like to manage a lot of injuries, and this one in particular, is what I would call biphasic. So we have, a conservative phase, and then we have an aggressive phase. And so when you're really flared up, it's actually good to be conservative for a short time. And if we do that properly, it only takes a couple of weeks to get some, pain relief and some initial healing. Then we want to actually reverse things and start to be aggressive so that we can basically callus the tissues and make them almost bulletproof or impervious to further aggravation. So, that's where I think it does become an art form. I'm not a huge fan, honestly, of clinical modalities, the use of various things that we might have in a physical therapy clinic, or using nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs or injections. All of those things probably have a place, but I feel that their contribution is somewhat minimal. And I like to get into like structure and function kinds of issues. So what I'll do, I am much less in favor of orthotics use than I once was. I was trained to think that they had a bigger place than they probably do in many cases, but temporary or short-term use of an inexpensive off-the-shelf or over-the-counter orthotic in the presence of acute plantar fasciitis can be helpful, because if we go back to that etiology we were discussing, if we can just back those pronatory forces off a small amount, then we can reduce the stresses that are coming into the tissues and kind of let them catch up and heal. That makes total sense to me. You've got probably early on some good efficacy studies are showing with prolonged stretching. There's several ways to look at that, or also the use of night splints. Again, lengthening out tissues so that they're at a normal resting or functional length. And also with the plantar fasciitis, we typically see, especially if the sheets are tucked under the bed, that those tissues will tighten down and shorten at night. And so the first few steps in the morning can essentially be re-ripping things and be painful for folks, to use that graphic term there. So that's what I like to do, is I like to say, look, if it's irritated, it's probably, we need to reduce training workload to some extent. Doesn't mean you can't hike or run if that's what you were doing, but we probably need to do it at reduced volume and intensity. And we might want to pump in some more cross training where we're using low or non-impact modes of aerobic exercise and doing more strength work or those kinds of things. But eventually a person's going to feel better. And that's when I would usually say, well, you've healed, but you've not rehabilitated. And so in other words, a healed tissue is one that's no longer painful, and there may be some amount of scar infiltration in the tissue, but a tissue that's fully rehabilitated and trained back up is now capable of doing practically anything it's designed to do or that you want to do with it. And so that's where I would go through. It depends on how much time I can talk a person into committing to this, but 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks of focused training, so that the likelihood is that they will maybe not ever have this again, but the odds of having it again are extremely reduced if they train properly. And that's where it's hard, because a lot of times if a person's out of pain, they sort of, pain's a motivator. And if it's not there, they can lose motivation. But if they're feeling the love there, I would put them through some general movement competency training with some of the basic patterns like hinge, lunge, squat. We want to have that. We want to have it coordinate with, what the diaphragm, the rib cage, the visceral contents, the the pelvis is doing, how respiration is affecting. All those things actually really help the foot. But I'd also start working in some specific foot strengthening. And that would be, again, working down out of a supportive shoe into a minimalist or barefoot condition. And then also really start looking at, now we want to start doing hopping and jumping and skipping drills, and even some plyometrics like jumping and landing. It doesn't have to be off extreme heights or high boxes, but a small amount of that stuff can really be a massive preventative dose for future injury, and also help performance in some ways perhaps as well.
You bet. The plantar fasciitis is a through hike ending injury for many people. And so I'm really glad to have this conversation, because I think paying a few ounces of prevention to mitigate some of this in a long through hiking effort would be incredibly valuable for people. I want to transition into the metatarsals. Now, I don't want to talk about two types of metatarsal injuries, which are common, and that is the case when you have arthritis in the metatarsal joint. I've experienced that. And the case where you fracture a metatarsal. I have also experienced that. In fact, I rehabbed with you when I had a metatarsal fracture. But I do want to talk about metatarsal strain. And we are seeing this more and more, soft tissue strain in the metatarsals, because people are using more flexible footwear. I suspect it's an overuse injury. I don't know the etiology of it. I would like you to talk through that and talk to us about metatarsal strain in general.
Yeah, I love that. And so if we start from an anatomical perspective, the foot has 3 arches. And I think most people have heard of that, but there's the most obvious arch, which we call the medial longitudinal arch, and that's the big arch of the foot. There's also a lateral longitudinal arch, which is kind of a smaller arching configuration on the outside of the foot. And then we have what's called the TMA, or the transverse metatarsal arch. So the metatarsal bones, which are those shafts that go from the midfoot out to the toes, are designed when they are under highest load to be domed up or convex towards the ceiling or sky. And most of these metatarsal issues, and I know you didn't talk about like metatarsalgia and nerve irritation, but it could be lumped in here. But if we stick to thinking about the stress reactions and potentially stress fractures, a lot of that is due to loss of the transverse metatarsal arch. And so that arch, it's like a bridge with a keystone. It's very strong. But when it's flattened down or collapsed, again, careful, I have to be careful using that term, we don't have the integrity in the system. And now we have excessive bending stresses being placed upon those long, thin bones. And that's, I think, where this problem mechanically will start. And of course, if you go back and say, well, what's causing that? Usually it's either a person who has a bit more intrinsic mobility in their foot's more flexible, or again, something is happening that's keeping them in that pronated state when their body and foot is trying to push off.
With long distance hiking in particular, where you're looking at 15, 20, 30 mile days, day after day after day, you're putting an enormous amount of strain in flexible footwear on your soft tissues that connect the metatarsals. Now, I've studied my MRI over and over and over. These are not large tissues. These are not big muscles that you can work out in the gym. I don't think. They look to be a lot of tendons, ligaments. Maybe there's some muscle tissue in there. I'm not sure. But is there any way to train metatarsal connective tissue so that you can use flexible footwear over long distances?
Yes. So those intrinsic foot muscles, they're not massive, but they do work in concert with the extrinsic muscles, which are largely in the calf and shin, and they're running down with those long tendons. All those things together, can be trained and can be made more tolerant of loading. And it gets back to some of the same things we've talked about with training progression. Sure, we want to We want to minimize footwear gradually. We want to build volume and challenge of terrain gradually. We want to use more and more aggressive exercises in the gym. So that all that can be done in preparation. Yes. But these things, they really come down to two specific items. And one is load management. And you already spoke to that, because gosh, if you are covering 25 miles a day, day after day, that's a high load that starts to escalate or accumulate in your tissues, and you don't have a day off to recover. So we want to actually build up very gradually and be very specific with loads going into a trip. But the other thing is it's a metabolic problem, and it's really interesting. So a stress reaction, sometimes on some diagnostics tests, it shows up as a cloud of inflammation, and it usually can be considered a warning sign or a precursor to possibly a fatigue stress or a failure of bone, thus a stress fracture. Well, why it's a metabolic problem is that in bone is like the most vital tissue we have. It's turning over, I think, the most rapidly in the body, even more so than skin. And so we have buildup occurring, which is a product of osteoblasts, and then we have breakdown, which is a product of another specialized cell called osteoclasts. And that's just going on all the time. But what can happen is if we start to throw in so much load and so much stress, it will heighten the osteoclast activity such that the osteoblasts can't keep up and build and renew the bone, so the bone begins to become weak. And the other part of the metabolic issue is the nutritional demand. And so I think these days we're all very aware that, vitamin S, sunshine is really the way to get vitamin D, and it's critical. But also, through diet and, vitamin D in and of itself and protein consumption are now being shown to probably be more important than, say, calcium or phosphorus. And, we do have easy ways to get that in the diet. So if we take a person and say, well, if you want to be on the preventative side, we're going to train smart and eventually hard or heavy, however you want to define that term, but we're also going to provide nutritional support. And in doing that, we're depending upon what authority you're talking about, whether it's the American College of Sports Medicine, the ADA, AHA, AMA, whatever. Most thought leaders in research are now going to say as much as 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight per day for hard training athletes, especially if those athletes are older and or are possibly trying to improve body composition in the process. So when we do that, we are actually gradating or managing the stimulus to build bone and strengthen it. At the very same time, we're providing the optimal amount of building blocks to allow for that process. So it's like a construction site. You've got the right amount of workers, the right materials. It's happening on schedule versus turning into a dumpster fire.
That's a really powerful argument against the all calories are created equal philosophy of ramen noodle through hiking. And I'm really happy to hear you say it.
It's really nice to see us take whole body health into consideration. A lot of long distance hikers, as Andrew alluded to with all calories are created equal, don't view this, especially it's especially important as they get older. If you look at nutrition, sleep, and then you see a thru hiker carrying, 1,000 calories a day of Little Debbie's and a thin foam sleeping pad, and they wonder why they're feeling trashed consistently. Now, the 20-year-olds are excluded from this because they're 20. But for the rest of us, these are big issues that we have to address. So I'm really happy the conversation is progressing to a whole health framework here.
Yes, and if I was just to respond to that, I would say I agree with you. When people are young, or even if they're very well conditioned, they can get away with a few things in the short term. And so sometimes, especially when you're backpacking, you're looking at that calories to weight ratio sometimes more even than nutrient density.
Yeah.
And I think there's even a place for processed foods, again, trying not to use always and never. But I think our baseline diet, when we're just going through every day and training and whatever, we should really pay as much attention to quality as we can. And I know there's a lot of debate out there about, is it plant-based? Is it animal-based? Is it low carb? Is it high carb? There's probably a middle ground that it's broad where most people can exist. But yeah, I think you're right again. And that's what I build into my model with any athlete or client that I'm working with is we start with a foundation of health, or otherwise training doesn't work. And so, it won't take. And so what I have in my model as the 5 components of lifelong health, and you can present them in any order. It's food, sleep, movement, ergonomics, and awareness. And so I won't waste your time going through those things, but yeah, we want to have good food and good sleep, as you indicated, and just not a place to skimp either in prep or when you're out there.
All right, so let's get to the meat of the metatarsal question. Once you have this injury, how do you rehab it?
Well, there are probably some similarities to what we were talking about with plantar fasciitis, but specifically with these, if the condition has progressed to fracture and we've got, let's say, a visible defect in the cortical bone, that's that outer hard bone layer, you have to protect that. The body's going to want to heal it automatically, and most fractures heal in about 6 weeks, and some of them, these types, if they're minor, that might be 3 or 4 weeks, believe it or not. But so it has to be protected. So does that mean a walking cast or boot? Possibly. Does it mean a more supportive or stiffer footwear for a short term or an orthotic? Possibly. But again, we've got to let that heal. And usually symptoms are a decent guide, but there's always, the standard would be to have a follow-up x-ray and determine that there's been healing. So once the thing is healed, then we go back into optimizing the beast and making the machine just a better functioning entity. And so we take the organism and we say, okay, well now, we want to build you back up to be able to walk miles in the mountains with some amount of load. Even though this is backpacking light, there's still a load. And that's how, we want to do it. But I'm also of the mindset that especially as we get older, we have to do a small amount of things that just keep our versatility and our vitality present. And so just those little bits that you can add into your home gym workouts where you're not just taking a hike, but you're actually doing a few lunges and mobility exercises and strength exercises. I think that's really a key that I've learned over time to always come back to is, we have to be so holistic in how we manage almost everything.
Yeah, I've fractured metatarsals twice, and that initial period of rest and immobilization, not immobilization, reduced mobilization is really critical. On one time when I rehabbed it, I was too aggressive, and it took a long time to heal. The last time I fractured a metatarsal, I did the 3 weeks where I really immobilized it as much as I could. I wore stiffer, more supportive footwear. And then when that 3-week period was done, I was able to train pretty aggressively again. And it was like night and day from the first time I rehabbed my broken foot. So let's transition into something a little bit different now. Sprained ankles are probably the number one injury for, I would say, unconditioned hikers who are wearing less supportive footwear, but we see it in supportive footwear as well. So it's not unique to less supportive footwear. We'll get to the healing part of a sprained ankle, but it's so different than a bone break because there seems to be a trend now where if you sprain your ankle, you're on it the next day and you're trying to keep those tissues healing in an aligned manner. So let's talk about first what happens in an ankle sprain, like what's going on, what is being sprained, what types of ankle sprains are there?
Sure. Most commonly, people will recognize the rolling of the ankle as an inversion sprain where the ankle lateral malleolus on the outside of your lower leg where it joins the foot there. It kind of rolls outwards and your arch lifts up towards midline. And so that's called an inversion sprain. And we have a ligament complex, tough connective tissue holding that malleolus to the foot. And it's called the lateral ligament or lateral collateral ligament complex. Most of the time when we roll, we injure the anterior talofibular ligament. So it attaches the fibula to the talus. Sprains are typically graded 3 ways. If it's a mild stretch, that's a grade 1, partial tear grade 2, ruptures grade 3. You can determine this clinically as well as with other diagnostics. And most of us have had that. Usually there's immediate pain, sometimes a snap or a pop, swelling and discoloration go with the territory. So that's what's happening. And you may have another question or two related to this, but what you had alluded to is I think the trend now is sound in that as soon as we can, we want to get early motion in some protected manner to affect collagen deposition and rates of healing and whatnot. But I would say that some of the icing related literature and cold tanks has gotten a bit twisted, because we do know that if your goal after a workout is to get, let's say, maximum muscular hypertrophy or adaptations, you might not want to take an ice bath immediately after, because it can suppress those things somewhat. So that kind of took off, and then people started thinking, oh, well, ice is terrible. You never ice anything, and you just get going as soon as possible. Well, if you have, 48 to 72 hours where you've got a raging inferno of torn tissue, you're probably best served to protect that and even cool it down a little bit, because if you keep in mind, some amount of inflammation is good because it stimulates, repair and reconstruction, but too much actually accelerates the amount of scar that's put down. So again, we always have to be careful in our interpretation of the science. This is an acute issue for me right now. 3 weeks ago, I was walking in the dark. I did not have my phone, so I didn't have a light with me, and I was in the woods. And I stepped off the road I was walking on. It was completely pitch dark. There was no starlight or moonlight or anything. And I stepped off into a ditch, and the ditch was about 2 to 3 feet deep. And I had no idea. And I landed on my right ankle, and boy, it got beat up pretty bad. It was a pretty severe strain. It was a grade 2 on the ATFL. I had ATFL surgery in 2006, and that surgery was done to shorten the ATFL a bit. And the area of my surgery was fine, but above and below it is where the sprain occurred. And I iced it for about 36 hours, very aggressively. And then I was on it, and I was hiking a mile within a couple of days. And so I've, it's still swollen. It still hurts. It's, definitely not ready to go backpacking on, but, I've had several ankle sprains in the past, and this is the one that has surprised me the most about, just taking that first day and a half to ice it and rest it, and then start being pretty aggressive with rehab. And I'm really happy with where it's going. So it's an interesting thing, compared to rehabbing an ankle sprain from, 30, 35 years ago. Yeah. That makes me want to speak to several things. Eventually maybe just touch quickly on taping and bracing. But when you think about how these injuries occur, unlike the other two that we were discussing, which are kind of viewed as overuse injuries in air quotes, this is a traumatic injury. It's accidental in most cases. And really what happens, it's instantaneous, but we have a momentary or pulsatile even loss of maintenance of the center of mass over the base of support. So, you just get thrown off balance in any number of sporting applications. And then suddenly, gravity is acting on these tissues in ways that they weren't prepared for. And most of these things are happening inside of 50 milliseconds. So we can't really react and correct for it. And so it's unfortunate. And I'm glad to hear that you're making some progress. That's how I would have managed it as well. I've said, let's get you, as soon as possible, walking and moving and doing some even some non-weight bearing exercises. Probably not aggressive terrain hiking just yet, or
Right.
back then, but that's how I would have done it. So then people talk about the braces, and so in some sports, they wear braces prophylactically, and the data suggests that the brace may actually lock up some motion and prevent the injury, but on the other hand, it's locking up motion, and so the athlete may lose some of their proprioceptive sense, or stress may be thrown up the chain, which may be aberrant at the knee or hip because the ankle's not able to do what it's normally supposed to do. And on the taping, it's really interesting. We continue to see all kinds of tape used, like obviously in a lot of the, so even high school, but collegiate and pro sports, the ankle taping is, rampant. They have several, usually ATCs doing that. It's their full-time job. Most of the studies say the tape loses its support in about 15 minutes, but it does enhance some type of proprioceptive, awareness, or can. And then I'm off on a tangent here. You can forgive me, but the KT tape phenomenon. Sometimes a few years ago, you could watch an athletic event and a person's almost taped from head to toe. They've got various straps and tape all over them. And again, there's a place for everything, but I think they can be taken too far. So I like this idea that you're doing. So, okay, you're working your way back, and there's an innate intelligence in the being. I like to call it instinctive wisdom. That's the term I use. But when you really tune in, and you guys are intelligent, earthy, wholesome cats. I know that because I've known you, Ryan, for a while, and your judgment is spot on. And so I want to give you some reassurance that you'll, especially with your experiences, you'll craft your way back expediently.
Whenever a lightweight hiker sprains their ankle in trail running shoes, and if you confess this online, you're bound to get an invitation from the other side that said you should have been wearing boots. Now, you mentioned athletes wearing braces prophylactically. There's an argument for wearing hiking boots above the ankle prophylactically. What are your thoughts on that?
I'd go back to one of the things I suggested earlier. If you train on the terrain that you're going to, be on your hiker expedition regularly, and you wear that type of footwear, there's no reason to say you need more substantial footwear. Although it just depends. If you get into some, above tree line stuff that's off trail and it's talus and scree, and you can hike that in any shoe that you want, but sometimes just the work of stabilizing using extra tendon force and what have you, you might appreciate a slightly more substantial boot there. I'm in your camp as far as I don't know that we need to wear a ski boot, to go for a hike. My own preference would be to wear minimalist shoes most of the time for training and some outings. But why I wear kind of like the lightest flexible boots I can find is mainly because I like the little bit of height that keeps debris from getting in, even if most time I do wear gaiters, depending on the season. I like that they may have a semi-waterproof membrane. It's some things like that, but I'm not wearing them because I'm trying to stabilize my ankles, for example.
Right. Is it fair to suggest, and I have to admit that the ultralight backpacking community is sometimes its own echo chamber. And so I want to test something that we hear a lot. And that is, if we wear minimalist footwear and we go off balance and need to recover, it gives us more access to the entire chain to stabilize ourselves, the ankle, the knee, the hips, the back. Where if we're in a boot that locks in our ankle more, it will create higher stresses in perhaps the knee if we go off balance. Is that a reasonable assumption?
Well, I think that's absolutely correct. And your ability to access your cat-like agility would be most enhanced in a minimalist shoe. And it also gets back to talking about, well, we should train ourselves to be able to move reactively and fluidly and have suppleness. And so, if a person gets into the habit of just being a straight line critter and that's all they do, they actually get stiff and weak, and then they're less well prepared when something does happen. No boot's going to protect them. The other thing, in support of your argument, I'm just an unbiased source today, is, well, if we're going to go to the trouble and the dollars to buy carbon fiber and titanium and 900 fill down or whatever it is, why wouldn't we apply the same lightening technology to our footwear?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've finished through hikes and felt like I was unable to move along any plane that wasn't in a straight line up and down, and felt really, really weak in any other direction that I tried to move. So I can imagine that you can apply that backwards and build overall strength along multiple planes to improve your hiking strength.
Yes, and in support of that, Andrew, I would say 2 years ago I was on a backpack bivvy backcountry elk hunting trip. It was during the archery season, and it was, in your guys' standards, it wasn't too much. It was only 5 days, but I was out for 5 days, and it was a mobile situation. And I had one of my good friends was with me. Well, every day in the morning and in the evening, we spent 5 or 10 minutes. Generally, it was in the darkness, at wherever we were camping, doing some exercises. And we were doing some various lunges and squats and push-ups and rotational exercises just because it felt good to do. And I think it was offsetting some of the stiffening that was happening, because we're not so young anymore. And it paid off. Luckily we didn't have to do any downhill somersaults or rolls, fortunately, but nonetheless, I think that's also a great tip for any ultralight backpacker is, hey, you know what? Take a few of those exercises that you're doing or should be doing in your regimen, and then just find a way to get them in during the day, even if it's on a short break to take in some scenery or get some water or whatever it is that's going on.
Let's go ahead and transition into stress fractures. We talked a little bit about stress fractures in the metatarsals, so I don't want to beat that dead horse. But are there other bones in the foot or foot chain that are prone to stress fracture type overuse injuries for long distance hikers?
Yeah, most of the stress fractures occurring in the foot will be in the metatarsals. So the tarsal bones are of a shape that it's less common to say that. And excuse me. But going up the chain, tibial fractures are relatively common, as are femoral fractures. Those would be the two ones. So obviously the shin bone and the thigh bone. It kind of just gets into the same thing. It probably suggests then that something's going on mechanically to overload that bone and then create that imbalance of buildup and breakdown. And so a person could have a substitution or compensatory movement pattern from an old injury and maybe some stiffness or weakness built into their system. And they found a way to work around it. But then when you get out there under the true test of long days, it can be revealed or exposed. And so some of that, I think, is valid to say. I've also, I work with a lot of backpackers, hikers, hunters, but also a lot of runners, and among other things. And some of the long bone fractures in the tibia and in the femur are related to force management or ground reaction force. So let's say if a person is just a hard hitter, a hard striker, for any number of reasons, they hit the ground hard and that force has to go somewhere. So it goes up the chain. And if they maybe don't have the strongest quads, hamstrings, and glutes, so the big major muscles of the leg that allow them to keep a slight flexion angle or bent knee. That's really how we're best designed to absorb ground reaction forces through knee flexion. Then what happens is they're just taking more vibration through the bones and through the skeleton. And sometimes that can be the factor, almost like a tuning fork that you just keep wailing on. It's eventually going to crack.
John, is that an argument in favor of minimalist shoes because you are more aware of that impact force and feedback, or is that an argument in favor of more padding in your shoes to compensate for that ground force?
Oh, Andrew, I think you're spot on. I'm not aware of specific literature related to backpacking and hiking, but there's been quite a bit of good research, randomized controlled trials, double-blinded studies, not just observational stuff, on runners that do suggest that the less shoe you wear, the more delicate and light your strikes are and the better you manage them with your entire muscular system. Whereas if they put a heavy, quote unquote, maximalist shoe on a person, it almost puts the foot to sleep and they will pound harder. There are a couple studies, though, that there may be some flaws in that they were very short term. And so my suggestion would be over time, that brilliant beast is going to learn to accommodate. But nonetheless, this has been my anecdotal experience as well. If you want to improve your landings and make them softer, at least some of the time practice doing that without, a big block of cement on your foot.
Yeah, I've had a lot of success doing long ultra runs, even in minimalist shoes. But there have been times when I have injured myself because I've come up on the end of my ability to step lightly over the ground at the tail end of my energy level. And then I'm just slogging through a race and I'm pounding in shoes that I'm not made to pound in simply because I don't have the energy to do anything else.
Yeah, and I think that's a commonly seen occurrence in any like ultra distance type of event. You actually can see this in your local 10K sometimes, depending on the training status of say a runner. And once the muscular system becomes depleted of glycogen and the neurologic system starts to get fatigued, then we actually can't time and control those contractions as efficiently. So then you are exposed to greater forces. But I would still come back and say that's a byproduct, not necessarily a byproduct, but it's something that's related to training, which we can work around. And I do see people, though, who do that on the first stride, walking or running, because honestly, they just don't know any better because they've only ever worn these heavy shoes. And so they throw their foot out in space and eventually it slams down on the ground. And that's because they really haven't trained their neuromotor system to function the way it's designed and function optimally. So I try not to use mean terms, but I will call these types of things like flap slap or slam slop, because it's exactly what you're seeing. And sometimes, when you use a term like that, it helps to cue a person like, oh, I am doing that. I need to correct that. And like, yeah, let's work on that.
Can you come up with any kind of justification or sales pitch for a shoe that's minimalist other than in stack height, something like the Hokas, where you've got a 30 or 40 or 45 millimeter stack height, massive amount of cushioning underfoot. These are incredibly popular types of shoes, and they're made by several manufacturers for running and now backpacking.
I don't love those shoes, to be honest. I would say, first of all, if, though, we have a person who probably is a runner more than a walker or hiker, and maybe they live in an inner city where they can't even get to a park very often, and so the surfaces that they have available to run on are asphalt and then many times concrete. So if it's flat and smooth, there may be some benefit, because if you think about it, concrete is not a natural surface. The density of it and the forces are much greater than sand or dirt or grass. So I'm a fan of being minimalist on natural surfaces, but if you're going to be on an unnatural surface, there's a place for a shoe like that. And maybe if you scale it down, you say, well, even if, like, say you're just doing some of your walking for conditioning, the most minimal of shoes may not feel as good to you as something with just a little bit more midsole stack height there. But now if you say, well, let's look at being on trail or in the mountains, I'm totally against those shoes because, first of all, they're so thick, they decrease feel, and we lose how the neurologic system's designed to work, but also they create a magnificent lever for ankle sprains, among other things, because now you're jacked up and you're not on a smooth level surface. In fact, there are hardly any smooth level surfaces out there. You're always stepping down on something irregular. So it's actually increasing injury risk in that specific situation.
They feel so good, though.
and I see the marketing. I know you're joking, that's interesting because we come up against, I think, in many of the things that we do, people get brainwashed, and we're inundated with media and marketing to lead us to believe something, and whether that's about diet or cardiovascular health, those are big ones where there's been quite a bit of deception. Footwear is true as well, and they're finding ways to sell these things, and ultimately the joke's on us.
I want to transition just slightly to talk about pack weight for a few minutes. Obviously, this is the Backpacking Light podcast, so we're in favor of as light as possible. But we wanted to get your expert opinion on exactly what pack weight is doing to the body from a biomechanical standpoint, the strain on every part of the chain.
So, Andrew, when you sent me those questions the other day, I took a look at that and I thought about it for a moment, and I thought, well, it's basically increasing the effects of gravity. So we have a greater compression moment, going down through the bones and asking the muscles to hold the body up. Then we have more mass to move. And if you're, on a different types of terrain and you're leaning a bit, there's more tensile load, particularly in the quote unquote trunk or core or hips. All those things are true. But it's really interesting to me because pack weight is perhaps inversely related to pack design and pack fit. And so a really well-built pack that's fit really well, you can have much more weight in it than one that's not like that. And you don't mind it as much. And also strength comes in because not only if you have a good fitting pack, but the stronger you are, the less you mind that amount of weight. And so I think the goal would always be to get it as light as possible because over time, ounces matter. And I agree entirely. I was born in the 60s. I grew up in the 70s. So, the old aluminum frame pack, that was my first exposure to doing these things. And I probably threw in a cast iron skillet and, who knows what, because, you could do that then. That was how that went. But nonetheless, I think if we look at this weight thing and we train to be able to tolerate much more weight than we're using on the field of battle, for example, that's the best win of all. If you condition an athlete to maybe go out on some of their training hikes and carry more weight than they're going to need to carry on the expedition, that's going to help them. And then also, I'm a big fan of training with sandbags of any type. I like the ones that you can make with an inner tube. I find they mold to the body better than the commercial models. But doing some things where you've just got that load on you, it's a huge return on investment and just well worth anyone's time.
You're talking about like sandbag, like doing squats with a sandbag or lunges or things like that, or even like walking, like farmer carry style stuff.
Yeah, squats and lunges are great. One of my favorites, if you have a stadium available, like a football stadium or any other thing, it's just throwing. You can use a pack as well if you have it, but you throw that sandbag on and then just walk. You don't have to do sprints necessarily, but that's a wonderful way to strengthen and just get some extra conditioning in, so that all of a sudden when you put on your well-fitted pack with the light gear, you barely notice it's there, maybe until the 8th hour of the 5th day or whatever the case may be.
My favorite training activity is to find a hillside as steep as possible, filling my pack up with water, hiking up the 1,000 or 2,000 feet to the top, pouring the water out, and then repeating it. Just to make it easier on my knees coming back down. But I have long trained with weights for short durations that are much heavier than my pack weight in the field, and it has been. You're right. It's a huge return on your investment.
Yeah, and I would also say trekking poles are amazing. I don't think you need them for all your training, but if you use them when you're out there, they've helped me. I'm sure. It depends on the situation.
Yeah, especially keeping you stable under a heavy load. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of specifics here. What are some general best practices people can do on a day-to-day basis to keep their feet healthy and strong?
Okay, if we're sticking with the feet, you never want to get too far from your thing, from doing the thing. And so an ultralight backpacker or backpacker hiker, let's just say that, you need to be hiking once or twice a week if you can in some way. And so always keeping that in your repertoire. And most people are going to say, well, I love doing it anyway, so I'm going to try to do that. But yeah, let's keep that in. I would also say develop a fairly simple strength and conditioning program specific for backpacking. And that might include some of those things that we just talked about, like, you're doing some steep hiking or lunges and squats and stadium steps, or even step ups on a park bench or something in your home. Those are really good exercises, no wasted time in there. And then a few other things that maintain all of your athletic capacities. And so one of the things I look at in my model is there are 5 major capacities of athleticism in the human, and you can present these in any order, but that's strength, speed, power, endurance, and agility. So we want to, strength is max force. So we want to have some amount of strength. You don't have to be a power lifter, for example, but that little bit of strength comes in handy. Let's say you're getting up with a fairly heavy pack from a low position, or you're moving some rocks or doing something at a campsite. Okay, strength has a factor. Power, now maybe you've got to turn on the jets to get up a short, steep section of something, or there's other applications. Speed's an interesting one because you wouldn't think speed would be really necessary, but it's actually built into a lot of our protective mechanisms as humans, such as escaping the oncoming bus or scooping up your grandkid in a situation. And so I think it's good to have that available. And also, if you're out there, if you've trained speed and agility, when you do get off balance or trip, a lot of times you can catch yourself or right yourself, or at least roll out of it. Wonderful. And then lastly, endurance that's a no-brainer, because we want that fatigue resistance to go along. So anyway, like any knowledgeable person, like in my field, a trainer, coach, therapist, that can help you if you need it, to design a program that's specific to your sports demands, your needs, and also like your body, what issues it has. Wonderful. I'd recommend that entirely. And then talking about the feet, again, some of that barefoot exercise. Now I have, and I can send you guys links to this if you want, or you can search for it on my website, thelifetimeathlete.com. There's a search bar, and there's a number of articles and podcasts that go over things like foot strengthening, plantar fasciitis, the Achilles tendon, athletic foot function, pronation, some of these topics that we've discussed. And most of them also have links to videos on my YouTube channel the Lifetime Athlete YouTube channel, or you can just look at it. And I think it'll give you some ideas for exercises. That may be a reasonable resource. But I've got two things that I often do with people that have had foot injuries or were trying to get their feet to be more highly functioning. And it's this. Can you get on a picnic table, jump off, stick the landing, don't think about it, no worries. And if most people are like, ooh, I'm not so sure I could do that. Well, that's a goal to work towards. Now, obviously, with every population, we want to be cautious in how we progress towards that. And maybe it's not the table, maybe it's just the bench, and that might be fine. But that's really important to look at those abilities of jumping and landing and force management in the body. The other thing, it's kind of along the same lines. Can you jump rope barefoot on concrete for 1 minute? And if a person says, no problem, I can do that easily, then you probably have that durability of the tissues that's going to serve you well. But if you're like, ooh, then you know that you might want to build that up a bit more.
John, this has been fantastic. Is there anything that you wanted to say that you haven't gotten a chance to say yet? Or maybe an even more important question, anything that we should know that we just are too stupid to have asked you yet?
Well, first of all, I would say you guys, I know you to be brilliant, so I would never say that anyway. But no, this has been really fun and great honor for me. It's a real privilege to talk about some of these topics, which are in my wheelhouse, and they relate to yours. And I love that building of community that we're doing. If anyone wants to know what I'm up to, you can find me at thelifetimeathlete.com or on Instagram at the Lifetime Athlete. Those are the main ones. And, most of my stuff is available there. I've got some ebook programs that I've been running for a couple of years that are turning into online courses for next year. So some of that stuff will be out by the first of the year. And one of them is also, it's really a program designed for training the backcountry hunter, but it has some programming in it, which may be of interest, and some other things. I also have a very easy access online training platform, which is called the Training Tribe. And it's essentially a group coaching and training platform. It's like a team. And we do the distribution or the dissemination of weekly programming, and we have meetings and classes and different things. And it's designed around an annual training plan that I've developed. So that's an ATP that's common in, the sports training world. And I looked at those 5 components: strength, speed, power, agility, and endurance. And I said, well, let's periodize the year into 2 to 3 month blocks, and then create programming mostly designed for the home gym that works on all 5 concurrently, but is biased or dominant in one in each of the blocks. And so you can go through the year using this as a supplemental program to your hiking and other pursuits, and be assured that you're working on all those things that allude to many of the things that we talked about. So that people can check that out. And there are other programs out there like it, but that's what I'm up to. I love doing this kind of work and talking about it, obviously, as you can tell. So thank you again.
John, thank you. And the contributions you're making to this space are tremendous. And it's so good to see you come up with training resources that are based on your very practical and long-lived experience, not only in the field, but working with athletes like us. And I appreciate it, because there's so much garbage out there, and it's just so nice to see good, solid information. And we've really enjoyed having you on our podcast today.
Thanks again. And back at you guys. I follow what you do, and I've learned a lot from you. So thank you.
Okay, so Ryan, coming out of that interview, I thought it might be interesting to chat for a few minutes about some of the footwear that we're looking at for 2022. And I think footwear is interesting because it wears out so quickly that it really presents an opportunity to iterate and play around with different options almost by necessity. Like, there's no reason to use a different tent every year, but almost always you're going to be using a different pair of shoes every backpacking season. So what are you looking at for the upcoming 2022 backpacking season?
Well, I live in the mountains, so my season always starts off with winter footwear. And the last several seasons, I've looked at Ultra Lone Peak, the waterproof breathable mids, the Hoka Speed Goat mids, and recently the La Sportiva. I don't remember the name of them, but they have two different mid models. One is a little bit heavier, more technical, which I really appreciate for alpine climbing and things like that. And then another pair that's more like a trail running shoe. This year, I've gone to something completely different that's minimalist, but I have faith that it's going to be quite durable. Mm-hmm. So for winter, I size up my shoes significantly because I want to make room for winter socks, big, thick winter boot socks, usually merino wool. Or if it's even colder than that, I will take a mid-weight hiking sock and put a waterproof Gore-Tex over sock over that. So I need room in my shoe and sometimes a vapor barrier liner as well. I need room in my shoe to accommodate those layers. So if I measure my foot on a Brannock device, it's about an 8.5 length and it's about a 9 width. So I typically size up to about an 11 to accommodate that space for the extra stuff in there and space for my foot, because in the winter I want more space because it allows me to flex my foot more, not squish it in there, and I get better circulation and that keeps my feet warmer. So that's like fundamental to me. So this year I've gone to a shoe called the Astral Pisca, and this shoe has some really interesting features. It's got some that aren't very unique, such as a wide toe box. Okay, the Ultra Lone Peaks have a wide toe box. It has a low drop. So the Lone Peaks and the Speed Goats, they both have a low drop. Some of the shoes from Salomon and La Sportiva that I've worn in the winter, they are not a low drop shoe per se. So these accomplish both of those things, which for me just contributes to all day comfort because I'm so used to a low drop shoe. And when I go into a high drop shoe now, it actually tweaks things around and causes me some pain in my plantar fasciitis and things like that. So low drop is pretty important to me. The unique things about this shoe that are different than almost any other winter trail running boot shoe that I've used are the sole and the outer. Now the sole is probably the best gripping sole on wet rock that I've ever used. I don't know what it is. I haven't studied it in depth, and I haven't talked to the designers of the shoe yet, but there's some chemistry to it that when it gets wet and you are trying to climb up slick, wet rocks on it, it sticks pretty darn good. Certainly better than most of the other shoes I've tried. The feature that really excites me about this, though, and you can see it here, is you're looking at a shoe where the upper is 100% Cordura. There is no mesh whatsoever in this shoe. And so that gets me really excited because my shoes are retired because the uppers wear out. That's the only reason I ever retire a shoe. That's always what wears out. And that's true with winter boots as well. So now I've got a shoe that has no mesh, no weird materials in it. And I have faith that this is going to maintain its waterproofing and it's going to maintain its durability over the course of one or maybe more seasons. We'll see how it goes. But I've had the chance to use this now for several weeks. We have winter now here, and I've used it with spikes and snowshoes, and I pair it with gaiters, and it's proving to be a super fantastic shoe for the cold, wet winter conditions that I'm using it in right now.
Yeah, it's a clean looking design. The only thing I can think of that's close to it, I tested Zero Shoes Alpine. I think they just called it the Alpine last year, and it was kind of a mid-height boot sort of design like this. But my big gripe with that shoe was that it was, for a winter boot especially, not very grippy. It was zero drop. It was very flexible, very comfortable, but it just doesn't have the traction that I want out of a shoe like that. And these that you're looking at have 5mm lugs, and that's great to hear about the rubber.
Yeah, interestingly, the lugs are exactly what I want for winter. You'll see a lot of snow or mud shoes have these big, widely spaced lugs. The Innovate mud claws come to mind.
Mm-hmm.
So they tend to be very tall and widely spaced apart. The problem with those in the snow, though, is they don't have the ability to center the snow between the lugs because there's so much space. And so you actually have pretty poor traction in the snow. They're great for mud. They're great for tundra. But for snow, you want a balance. You want something that has some widely spaced lugs so that you can get the lugs down into the snow, but you want some narrow spaced ones as well so that you can center the snow and lock your shoe into that snow surface. And these have them. You can kind of see it here. You've got wide spaces between rows of lugs here, and then you've got some narrow spaces in between individual lugs. And it works surprisingly well in the snow. We went on a hike yesterday. It was about 7 miles in Rocky Mountain National Park. It was fairly firm snow and fairly steep. We did a lot of climbing, and they did great. I didn't wear traction spikes or anything and was really, really happy with them.
Awesome. Well, keep us updated, especially as the winter comes to a close, because I'd love to know how they held up in a few months.
Yep. And you live in the mountains too, and you're going to talk about some sandals.
I'm looking at hiking sandals for a very specific use case, which happens to not be where I live here in the Sierra. I'm planning a month-long hike in July in a temperate rainforest in a very warm, humid part of the country. And I have some experience with hiking sandals. I wore Chacos on the Appalachian Trail for the bulk of it. And I don't think that they're right for every situation. I really don't. I've tried wearing them out west, and it's a nightmare. But in a situation that the temperature doesn't drop below 60 degrees ever in the morning and the evening, and where there's a lot of mud and it's going to rain every day, and I could be crossing streams 10, 11, 12, 13 times a day, I think that might be the optimal use case for hiking sandals. So I'm kind of looking forward to giving them another try. So the ones I have my eye on are the Cairn Pro 2 Adventure Sandals from Bedrock Sandals. What I like about these is that they're zero drop and they're relatively light, unlike a lot of hiking sandals, especially Chacos, which are kind of famous for being just huge chunky blocks of rubber. And they have nice, durable Vibram soles with a grippy tread pattern that's kind of aimed specifically at mud and wet, slick circumstances. And the toe strap style is sort of comes up between your toes as opposed to over the top of your foot. And I'm interested in how that will work as well. So it could be a total disaster, but I am really interested in trying them out.
I had a colleague of mine early in my career who was coming out to visit, and we were doing a hike in the southwest desert of Utah. And he was a rabid sandal fan, wrote about it. Every picture in every magazine you saw showed him wearing open-toed sandals. And so I thought, I'm going to be just as cool as him, and I'm going to wear sandals too. And I figured, it's the desert. It's the perfect environment for them. We met at the trailhead, and he got out of the car and slung his pack over his shoulder, and he was wearing trail running shoes. And I said, what are you doing? You're not wearing sandals. He said, this is a terrible environment for sandals. And I said, why? And it was because it's so hot and dry down there and the humidity is so low that he said your feet crack. And then with the cracks, you get sand coming in and all this crazy stuff. And I just thought, wow, did I screw this up? And so I fortunately had a pair of tennis shoes in my truck and switched to those. But it taught me the lesson that, yes, there are definite use cases. I was thinking about your hike in the rainforest with sandals, and humidity being one thing, temperature being the obvious other. I've experimented a lot with sandals. I've worn them in treks in Yellowstone National Park and the Beartooth Wilderness. And the two things that I do not like about wearing sandals in the Rocky Mountains specifically are, number one, the fact that it's really rocky, and I don't have the coordination to deal with it, but I constantly injured my toes probably muscle memory. I don't know. It's just I'm not used to that environment. And then the second one being you combine a dry environment with cold temperatures and it is miserable. So warm and wet sounds pretty good to me.
It does. Yeah. I did half the Colorado Trail in my trusty Chacos, and I was miserable every step of the way. Every step of the way. I've finally just got some different shoes sent to me, but I had a lot of success with them on the East Coast, on the northern half of the Appalachian Trail. Now, in my particular hike, by the time I started to get further south, it was starting to get on into fall. And in the mornings in particular, man, it's hard to get out of camp with cold feet stuck in the sandal. So, it's all about the use cases. But for sure, I'll keep everybody updated on this. All right, well, let's talk for a few minutes about what's new at BPL. I'd like to start out by pointing people towards the recent article that we published by Rex Sanders, where he went through very systematically and tested a portable battery charger. And this is sort of the prelude to another larger series of tests that he's going to do, comparing a couple of different articles, a couple of different portable battery chargers. But this article I thought stands out because of the level of detail that Rex took, the tests he designed, and the useful information it generated. What did you think about it?
It opened my eyes to the fact that, and we've always kind of been skeptical about manufacturers' claims about the performance of their gear. It's obviously no different in the world of battery chargers. There is a level of energy that they will claim exists in their charging device that does not exist in the real world. And we're not talking about just degradation due to cold temperatures or user error. We're talking about the actual usable capacity of a battery pack is probably always going to be a notable amount less than what they claim in the specifications. So if we can't rely on their specification to predict how much juice we need to keep our electronics charged in the backcountry, Rex's data is going to help us understand that and put those factors of safety in place. So ultimately, this is a piece that allows us to help hikers and other backcountry users to make better decisions about the planning of their electronic charging in the backcountry.
How about you? What would you like to point people towards?
We did a members Q&A on backcountry electronics as well, about the same time Rex's article was published, and so that was super enlightening. Now, we've been doing member live stream Q&As for all of our members, basic, premium, and unlimited, for the past several months, and you can find those online at the website. We've done several now, and we're doing another one on Wicking. Basically, it's going to be tied into Steven Sieber's recent article on how does Wicking work, where he brings in all this education about what Wicking actually is, what it means to the backcountry user, and then he does some tests to say, do fabrics that claim to wick actually wick, and where does this fall into our clothing systems? And the results are a little bit surprising to me. So he tested some fabrics that are promoted as wicking fabrics that don't actually wick very well. And so reconciling, again, what manufacturers are saying happens with their gear with what actually happens in the real world doesn't mean the gear is bad. It means we need to reconcile our expectations for that gear and use those items appropriately in the system we want to design. And that's going to be the focus of the next members Q&A, which will be on wicking and creating systems based on different types of wicking layers in your layering system. And so this will piggyback on top of our layering systems members Q&A, which was streamed a few months ago, and go more in depth into the actual base layer fabrics and wicking fabrics phenomenon. And so that will be January 27th, Thursday, 6 p.m. U.S. Mountain.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Backpacking Light podcast. The Backpacking Light podcast is advertising free, thanks to the membership fees paid by Backpacking Light members. A BackpackingLight.com membership gives you access to 20 years of archives, forums, and online courses. And don't forget, if you're an unlimited member, you'll get the video version of this podcast for free as a part of your membership. So please consider supporting this podcast and become a member right now at backpackinglight.com/membership.
You can download the show notes for this episode at backpackinglight.com/podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. It does help other people find the show.
Thanks for listening.
One parting message, it's this: pack less, be more, because lighter is better. Happy trails, everybody.
So I shoulder my backpack, walk away from the car.